In a world where survival was a daily battle, Jax had learned that kindness often came with no reward, until one cold night when a stray cat changed everything. Hungry, alone, and invisible to most, Jax never imagined that the simple act of sharing his last meal would set him on a path toward something far greater than survival. What he didn't know was that, in the shadows, someone was watching, and his life was about to be rewritten in the most unexpected way. The autumn wind howled through empty streets as Jax trudged home, clutching his only meal of the day. Exhausted and starving, he never expected that sharing his food with a desperate stray cat would do this. Fallen leaves swirled across cracked sidewalks as streetlights flickered to life against the darkening sky. The city always felt colder in October, especially at dusk when the warmth of day surrendered to the biting chill of evening. Jax pulled his thin jacket tighter, shoulders hunched against the wind that cut through the worn fabric like it wasn't. Even there, his delivery bag hung empty at his side, finally lightened after 12 hours of pedaling his rusted bicycle through the maze of city streets. The old bike creaked beneath him, each sound a reminder of yet another repair he couldn't afford. His worn sneakers were soaked through from the morning drizzle that had never quite stopped, his socks damp and uncomfortable against his skin. At 22, Jax had become so accustomed to being overlooked that it felt like a second skin. Customers barely noticed him as he moved between tables, their eyes fixed elsewhere, their indifference a quiet echo in the space between them. Some didn't even bother with a tip, as if he were nothing more than a fleeting shadow in their day. Tonight had been particularly brutal. 3 deliveries had taken him to the wealthy high-rise apartments across town, where residents complained about late deliveries despite the distance, and one customer had even accused him of stealing a side order that the restaurant had forgotten to include. But none of that mattered now. He had survived another day, and his shift manager had slipped him a small paper bag, a forgotten order that would otherwise be thrown away. "Don't tell anyone," she had whispered, her eyes softening momentarily. Inside was a chicken sandwich and small container of fries. Not much by most standards, but to Jax, who hadn't eaten since yesterday's half-price ramen, it was a feast. The aroma of warm food teased his empty stomach as he pedaled toward his usual resting spot, a small covered bus shelter with a bench that would provide temporary refuge before heading back to the crowded shelter where he'd been sleeping since losing his apartment 3 months ago. His stomach growled painfully, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since his last meal. Just a few more blocks, and he could finally eat. When Jax finally reached the bus shelter, he collapsed onto the metal bench with a weary sigh. His legs ached from pedaling, his back stiff from carrying the delivery bag all day. The shelter offered little comfort, graffiti-covered walls and the lingering smell of cigarettes, but at least it blocked the wind. Jax placed the paper bag on his lap, savoring the warmth that seeped through the thin material. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to make this moment last. When he finally opened the bag, the aroma of the chicken sandwich made his mouth water instantly. His hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped it, a testament to how desperately his body needed fuel. Just as he was about to take his first bite, a sound caught his attention, faint but distinct against the background noise of distant traffic, a soft, plaintive meow. Jax froze, the sandwich halfway to his mouth. The sound came again, slightly louder this time. He lowered the food and peered into the darkness beyond the shelter. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a slight movement caught his eye. In the shadows near the trash can, a small figure emerged cautiously. A cat, or what remained of one. Its grey fur was matted and dirty, clinging to a frame so thin that each rib was visible even in the dim light. One ear was torn, and it moved with a noticeable limp. But it was the eyes that struck Jax most. Wide, ember eyes that seemed to hold both fear and desperate hope. "Hey there," Jack said softly, his voice unexpectedly gentle. The cat startled, taking a step back before freezing again, its gaze fixed not on Jack's, but on the food in his hands. The animal's nose twitched, and Jax recognized the look, the same raw hunger he felt himself. He glanced down at his sandwich, then back at the cat. His stomach protested with another painful growl. The cat meowed again, a sound so weak it was barely audible over the wind. "You're hungrier than me, aren't you?" Jax whispered. Without allowing himself to reconsider, he tore off a piece of the chicken and held it out. The cat didn't move, watching him with wary intensity. Slowly, Jax placed the meat on the ground at the edge of the shelter. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with extreme caution, the cat inched forward. It snatched the chicken and retreated a few steps before devouring it in seconds. When it looked up again, those amber eyes seemed to bore into Jax's soul. "Yeah, I get it," he murmured, breaking off another larger piece. "Doesn't feel good to starve." The cat ate 4 more pieces before Jax realized he had given away half his sandwich. His own hunger protested, but something deeper than physical need kept him breaking off pieces until only a quarter of the sandwich remained. He shared the fries, too, placing them one by one where the cat could reach them without coming too close. As the cat finished the last fry, it sat back on its haunches and began to meticulously clean its face. For the first time, Jax noticed a small patch of white fur on its chest, shaped almost like a star against the grey. The cat paused its grooming to look at him, and Jax could have sworn there was gratitude in those amber eyes. "We're the same. You and me," Jax said, finishing his much-reduced meal in 2 bites, "just trying to survive one day at a time." When Jax returned to the same bus shelter the following evening, he didn't expect to see the cat again. Stray animals rarely stayed in one place for long in this part of the city. Yet as he approached, a familiar grey shape materialized from the shadows, amber eyes reflecting the streetlight. "You're still here," Jax said, surprised. The cat remained at a cautious distance, but watched him intently as he sat down. He had no extra food tonight. Tips had been non-existent, and his manager hadn't offered any leftovers. All he had was half a peanut butter sandwich he'd made from supplies at the shelter, his entire meal for the day. His stomach twisted with hunger, but something about those amber eyes made him pause. "I probably shouldn't do this again," he muttered, tearing the sandwich and placing half on the ground. The cat approached more confidently this time, maintaining eye contact as it ate. When it finished, instead of running away, the cat sat just beyond arm's reach, studying Jax with what seemed like curiosity. In the better light, Jax could see it was a female, her grey coat dulled by dirt, but revealing traces of tabby markings. The white star-shaped patch on her chest stood out starkly against the grey. "Star?" Jax said suddenly. "That's what I'll call you, because of that mark on your chest." Star blinked slowly at him, then began meticulously grooming her front paw as if accepting the name. For the next week, their routine continued. No matter how late or early Jax arrived at the bus shelter, Star was waiting. Sometimes he had food to share, sometimes only a few bites, but she never seemed disappointed. She just sat with him, a silent companion in the darkness. By the 8th night, Star had grown bold enough to sit beside him on the bench, though she still maintained a careful few inches of space between them. Jax had begun talking to her about his deliveries, about the rude customers and occasional kind ones, about the dreams he'd abandoned when his mother died and left him with nothing but debt. "I used to want to be a chef, you know," he told Star one night as she perched beside him. "Went to culinary school for a semester before Mum got sick. Had to drop out to care for her." He laughed without humor. "Now I deliver other people's food instead of making my own. Funny how life works out." Star watched him, her steady gaze somehow comforting. She was gaining weight, her coat looking slightly healthier, though the torn ear and limp remained. Jax realized with a start that he was looking better too. Not physically, perhaps, but something inside him felt less broken. "You're good company, Star," he said softly. "Better than most people I know." That night, when Jax stood to leave, Star did something new. She followed him. The homeless shelter's rule was absolute. No pets allowed. Jax knew this, but as Star limped along behind him that night, he couldn't bring himself to chase her away. Instead, he found a narrow alley about 2 blocks from the shelter, created a makeshift bed from discarded cardboard, and spent the night there with Star curled against his side for warmth. The following morning, Jax was late for his shift. Having missed the shelter's shower time, he arrived at work disheveled and exhausted. His supervisor, a thin-lipped man named Greer, was waiting by the time clock. "Late again, Preston," Greer snapped, using Jax's last name as he always did. "That's twice this week. Sorry, sir, it won't happen again." "It better not. One more strike and you're out. Do you have any idea how many people would kill for this job?" Jax nodded silently, knowing better than to offer excuses. As he turned to grab his delivery bag, Greer's nose wrinkled. "And for God's sake, clean yourself up. You smell like a stray animal." The day grew increasingly difficult. Rain came in sudden bursts, soaking Jax to the skin between deliveries. A flat tire cost him 30 minutes and nearly half a day's wages to repair. By evening, he was running on empty, having spent his lunch. Money on cat food he'd stashed in his delivery bag. When his shift finally ended, Jax pedaled wearily back to the bus shelter where he'd first met Star. To his relief, she was waiting, immediately rubbing against his ankles when he arrived. "Hey, girl," he murmured, crouching to scratch behind her torn ear. "Got something for you." He poured the cat food onto a piece of cardboard. His own stomach growled as he watched her eat, but the sight of her enjoying the meal somehow made his hunger more bearable. A week passed this way. Jax alternated between sleeping in the alley with Star and sneaking into the shelter alone on particularly cold nights. His performance at work deteriorated as fatigue took its toll. Tips decreased as his appearance grew more haggard, creating a vicious cycle he couldn't escape. One evening, as rain lashed the city streets, Jax huddled in the alley with Star tucked inside his jacket. The cardboard beneath them had turned to soggy pulp, and water seeped through his clothes. He was shivering uncontrollably, his lips tinged blue with cold. "We can't keep doing this," he whispered to Star, who purred against his chest despite their miserable conditions. "Something's gotta change." The next morning, Jax woke with a hacking cough and a fever. His limbs felt like lead as he struggled onto his bicycle. By the time he reached work, he was 30 minutes late, soaked to the bone, and barely able to stand. Greer took one look at him and shook his head. "That's it, Preston. You're done here." Jax stared at Greer, his fever-addled brain struggling to process the words. "What? You're fired, Preston. Clear out your locker." Greer crossed his arms. "I've given you plenty of chances." "Please," Jax's voice cracked. "I need this job. I'm sick, but I'll get better. I'll be on time tomorrow, I swear." "There is no tomorrow. Not here." Greer's expression hardened. "This is a business, not a charity." 20 minutes later, Jax stood outside the delivery company. His few possessions stuffed into his backpack, his security badge gone. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained grey and threatening, perfectly matching his prospects. He pedaled aimlessly through the city streets, his fever making the buildings tilt and sway around him. Somehow, he made it back to the alley where Star waited, curled up in the driest corner she could find. When she saw him, she meowed and trotted over, weaving between his legs. "I messed up, Star," he whispered, sliding down the wall until he sat on the damp ground. "I really messed up." That night, Jax's fever spiked. He shivered violently despite the mild temperature, his cough growing deeper and more painful. Star huddled against him, her small body providing insufficient warmth. By morning, he knew he needed help. The free clinic was crowded, but the nurse took one look at Jax's flushed face and moved him to the front of the line. Pneumonia, they told. He needed rest, warmth, antibiotics, all things that required money or a home, neither of which he had. "Is there someone who can help you?" the doctor asked, scribbling a prescription. "Family, friends." Jack shook his head. His mother was gone, his few friends scattered after high school. There was no one. The doctor frowned but slipped him samples of antibiotics from a cabinet. "These will get you started, but you need the full course, and you need to stay warm and dry. Is there a shelter you can go to?" Jax thought of Star, waiting in the alley. "No," he said, "there isn't." The doctor added, "I wish I could do more," she said softly. "But if you don't find shelter, this could turn deadly." By afternoon, Jax was back in the alley, his condition worsening despite the medication. Star watched him with worried eyes as he struggled to drink water from a bottle someone had given him outside the clinic. "Don't worry," he told her, his voice a raspy whisper. "We'll figure something out." But as dusk fell and rain began again, Jax knew they were running out of options. His small stash of cash would buy food for maybe 2 more days. After that, he couldn't bear to think about it. In desperation, he pulled out his phone, the one luxury he'd maintained by keeping the most basic plan possible. His vision blurred as he scrolled through employment listings, each one seeming more impossible than the last. Then his phone dinged, a final warning that his service would be disconnected in 24 hours for non-payment. Jax let the phone slip from his fingers. He pulled Star closer, burying his face in her damp fur. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Morning arrived with no mercy. Jax woke to find himself shivering uncontrollably, his clothes soaked through from a puddle that had formed where he slept. The antibiotics had barely made a dent in his fever, and each breath brought a stabbing pain to his chest. But what terrified him most was that Star was gone. "Star," he called weakly, his voice barely audible. He struggled to his feet, swaying, as dizziness washed over him. "Star, where are you?" He stumbled out of the alley, scanning the empty street. No sign of her. Had she finally given up on him? Found someone more capable of caring for her? The thought brought an unexpected wave of grief that made his eyes burn. It took all his strength to mount his bicycle. He had no destination in mind, just a desperate need to find the one friend he had left in the world. The city passed in a blur as he pedaled through familiar streets, calling Star's name whenever he had breath to spare. The effort sent him into coughing fits that left him gasping. By noon, Jax couldn't go any further. He collapsed on a bench in a small park, his body trembling with exhaustion and fever. The few people passing by averted their eyes, just another homeless person to ignore. His stomach twisted with hunger. He couldn't remember when he'd last eaten. In his pocket, he found his last $5, money he'd been saving for cat food. What was the point now? Star was gone. With shaking hands, he stuffed the bill back into his pocket and closed his eyes, too tired to even cry. The sound of distant thunder roused him from his half-conscious state. Dark clouds were gathering, promising another downpour. Jax knew he should move, find shelter, but his body refused to cooperate. His bicycle lay where he'd dropped it, the front wheel bent from his fall. As the first heavy drops began to fall, a cruel realization washed over him. He might not survive another night like this. The pneumonia, the hunger, the cold. It was too much. For the first time since his mother's death, Jax felt truly afraid. He tried to stand, but collapsed back onto the bench, his legs buckling beneath him. The rain intensified, plastering his hair to his forehead. Through the curtain of water, he thought he saw a small grey shape darting between trees. His fevered brain was playing tricks on him now. "Star?" he whispered anyway, hope a painful knot. In his chest. The shape moved closer, materializing into a familiar form, Star, soaking wet, but very real, meowing urgently at him. She paced back and forth, then ran a few steps away before looking back at him expectantly. "What is it?" Jax murmured. I can't follow you, I'm sorry." But Star was insistent, her cries growing more frantic. She darted forward, nipped gently at his pant leg, then retreated again, looking back with what seemed like desperation in her amber eyes. With the last of his strength, Jax pushed himself to his feet. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Lead the way." Each step was agony. Jax stumbled after Star, his vision blurring as fever and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. The cat kept looking back, meowing insistently whenever he slowed. They left the park and moved down unfamiliar streets, heading into a neighborhood Jax had never delivered to, an older part of town with brownstone buildings and small, well-kept gardens. "Where are you taking me?" Jax wheezed, clutching his side where each breath brought searing pain. Star didn't answer, of course, just continued her determined path, eventually turning down a narrow side street lined with cherry trees. At the end of the block stood a modest brick building with a green awning. Beneath the awning, a sign read, "Meridian Bookshop and Cafe." Star darted toward the shop's entrance, then sat expectantly by the door. Jax followed, more out of delirious obedience than understanding. As he approached, the door opened and an elderly woman stepped out, keys in hand. She was in her 70s with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Oh my," she said, noticing Jax immediately. Her eyes widened with concern. "Are you all right, young man?" Jax tried to respond, but instead a violent coughing fit doubled him over. He felt his knees buckle, the world tilting sideways as he began to fall. The last thing he remembered was the woman calling out and strong hands catching him before he hit the pavement. Jax awoke to unfamiliar surroundings. A small, cozy room with warm yellow walls and a window that looked out onto a brick courtyard. He lay in a comfortable bed, covered with a patchwork quilt. For a moment, he thought he must be dreaming. "Ah, you're finally awake," came a gentle voice. Jax turned to see the silver-haired woman from the bookshop sitting in a chair beside the bed. Next to her, curled in a plush cat bed, was Star, watching him with her amber eyes. "What? Where am I?" Jax croaked, his throat painfully dry. "You're in my apartment above the bookshop," the woman explained, pouring a glass of water from a pitcher. "I'm Eleanor Meridian, and you, young man, have a rather severe case of pneumonia." She helped Jax sit up enough to sip the water. "A doctor friend of mine has been by to see you. You've been asleep for nearly 2 days." Jax stared at her in disbelief, then at Star, who seemed perfectly at home in the cozy room. "I don't understand. Why would you help me?" Eleanor smiled, a warm expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Your little friend there has been quite persistent." She nodded toward Star. "She showed up at my back door yesterday morning, meowing and scratching until I followed her. She led me straight to the park where you'd collapsed." Jax's gaze returned to Star, who blinked slowly at him as if to say, "Of course I didn't abandon you." "But why would you bring a stranger into your home?" Jax asked, still struggling to comprehend the situation. Eleanor's expression grew more serious. "Because 50 years ago, someone did the same for me when I needed it most." She reached out to touch his hand. "Now, let's focus on getting you better. Then we can talk about what comes next." The next few days passed in a haze of rest, medication, and better food than Jax had eaten in months. Eleanor was a quiet but constant presence, bringing him soup and tea, checking his temperature, and ensuring he took the antibiotics her doctor friend had prescribed. Star rarely left his side, curled up either on the bed near his feet or in the cat bed Eleanor had provided. By the 4th day, Jax felt strong enough to sit in a chair by the window. Eleanor brought him a mug of hot chocolate and settled into the seat across from him. Thank you, Jack said, the words inadequate for what he felt. For everything, Eleanor smiled. You're looking much better. I think you might be ready for a proper tour of the place soon. I don't want to impose any longer than necessary, Jax began, but Eleanor waved away his concern. Nonsense, you're still recovering. She glanced at Star, who was grooming herself in a patch of sunlight. Besides, it seems your friend has decided this is home now. Jax followed her gaze. I still can't believe she found you. Of all the people in the city, perhaps not so surprising, Eleanor said, a curious expression crossing her face. This isn't actually the first time I've seen your cat. Jax looked up, confused. What do you mean? Eleanor leaned forward. About 3 weeks ago, I was locking up the shop when I noticed a grey cat with a distinctive white mark on its chest watching me from across the street. I left out some tuna, but by the time I returned with it, the cat was gone. That had to be Star, Jax murmured. But how? There's more, Eleanor continued. 2 days later, I found small paw prints through the flour I'd spilled in the cafe kitchen. Nothing was disturbed, but the back door hadn't been properly latched. She smiled at his surprised expression. And then last week, I actually saw her slipping out through the basement window early one morning. Jack stared at Star in amazement. She was scouting your place. I believe she was, Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling. Checking if I was trustworthy, perhaps, or learning the layout. Either way, when she needed help for you, she knew exactly where to come. Star blinked lazily at them, as if the conversation was of no interest to her at all. But there's something else you should know, Eleanor said, her tone growing more serious. Something that might explain why your Star was so determined to bring you here, specifically. She stood and crossed to a bookshelf, retrieving a framed photograph. She handed it to Jax. The photo showed a much younger Eleanor standing outside the bookshop with a tall, smiling man. Between them stood a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, holding a small grey kitten with a white star-shaped mark. On its chest, Jax's breath caught. Is that my granddaughter Lucy, with her cat Comet? Eleanor said softly. The resemblance to your Star is remarkable, isn't it? Same markings, same eyes. What happened to them? Jax asked, sensing the sadness beneath her words. Eleanor took the photo back, her fingers tracing the frame gently. Lucy and her parents moved to Europe 10 years ago. Comet stayed with me, but he passed away last winter. He was quite old. I'm sorry, Jax said. Eleanor's eyes were distant. The week after he died, I started leaving food out. Force of habit, I suppose, but I kept doing it even when I realized he was gone. She looked at Star with wonder. And now, here we are. A week later, Jax's strength had returned. The pneumonia was finally retreating, his cough reduced to an occasional reminder. As he helped Eleanor prepare breakfast in her small kitchen, he felt a sense of normalcy he hadn't experienced in years. I was thinking, Eleanor said, carefully flipping a pancake. The cafe portion of my shop has been closed for months now. I simply haven't had the energy to run both the bookstore and the cafe by myself. Jax nodded, setting plates on the table while Star weaved between his legs. That's understandable. Running 2 businesses would be a lot for anyone. Indeed, Eleanor agreed, but I've been considering reopening it. The regular customers ask about it constantly. She glanced at him with a meaningful look. I'd need help, of course. Jax paused, a fork suspended in midair. Are you offering me a job? Eleanor smiled. I'm offering you an opportunity. You mentioned you attended culinary school before your mother fell ill? Just for a semester, Jax said, surprised she remembered. Hardly enough to call myself a chef. Perhaps not, Eleanor conceded, bringing the pancakes to the table. But enough to handle a small cafe menu, I'd wager. Soups, sandwiches, pastries. Nothing too elaborate, Jack sat down, his mind racing. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Eleanor replied, pouring coffee for them both. "The apartment above the cafe has been empty since my assistant manager moved out last year. It needs some work, but it would give you and Star a proper home." Jack stared at her, overwhelmed by the generosity. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Eleanor's expression softened. "I know enough. I know you shared your last meal with a stray cat when you were starving yourself. I know you chose to sleep in an alley rather than abandon her. And I know what it's like to need a second chance." She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Besides, I'm not offering charity. I need the help, and I think you need purpose." Later that afternoon, Eleanor showed Jax the small apartment above the cafe. It was dusty and bare bones, but it had potential. A kitchenette, a bathroom with a real shower, a living area with a window that caught the afternoon sun, and a bedroom, just large enough for a bed and dresser. "It's perfect," Jax whispered, hardly able to believe his change in fortune. "It needs work," Eleanor cautioned. "New paint, some repairs. The plumbing's a bit temperamental." "I can fix things," Jack said quickly. "I used to help the maintenance guy at our apartment building when I was younger. He taught me a lot." Eleanor smiled. "Good. Then it's settled. We'll start on the apartment tomorrow, and when you're ready, we'll begin planning the cafe reopening." As they stood in what would soon be his new home, Star jumped onto the windowsill, her tail swishing contentedly as she surveyed the street below. The setting sun caught her fur, turning the grey to silver and making the white star on her chest glow. "She knew," Jack said softly. "Somehow she knew this was where we needed to be." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Animals have a wisdom we can only guess at. I think she recognized a kindred spirit in you, someone who gives, even when they have nothing left." 6 months transformed everything. The Meridian Bookshop and Cafe had become a neighborhood favorite, with lines often stretching out the door, and during lunch hours. Jax moved efficiently behind the counter, plating his signature sandwiches and ladling homemade soups that had developed something of a cult following among the locals. The apartment above was now truly his home. Fresh paint, second-hand furniture collected piece by piece, and small touches that reflected his emerging sense of self. Cookbooks lined up on a shelf, a collection of chef's knives he'd saved for, plants thriving on the windowsill. And, of course, Star's belongings, a proper cat tree by the window, toys scattered across the floor, and a plush bed she sometimes even deigned to use instead of Jax's pillow. "Order up for Mrs. Caldwell," Jax called, placing a steaming bowl of butternut squash soup and half a turkey avocado sandwich on the counter. Mrs. Caldwell was the elderly woman who'd become a regular customer. She smiled warmly as she collected her lunch. "Smells divine as always, Jax," she said. "And how's our Star employee doing today?" She glanced toward the bookshelf-lined wall where Star lounged regally on a special platform Eleanor had installed, overseeing the cafe's operations with apparent approval. "Queen of all she surveys," Jax replied with a laugh. The cat had become something of a mascot for the cafe. Customers came as much to see her as for the food and books. Eleanor had even added a small line to the cafe's sign, "Home of Star, the literary cat." Children would bring bits of approved treats, and regulars knew her favorite spots for petting. After the lunch rush subsided, Jax wiped down the counter and found Eleanor looking at him with an expression of quiet pride. "What?" he asked, suddenly. "Self-conscious, just thinking about the young man who stumbled into my life half dead 6 months ago," she said. "He's quite unrecognizable now." Jax felt a flush of pleasure at her words. It wasn't just his physical appearance that had changed, though that too was dramatic. Gone was the gaunt, hollow-eyed youth with dirty clothes and a persistent cough. In his place stood a healthy young man with clear eyes, a confident stance, and the beginnings of a professional demeanor. But the deeper changes were less visible. The constant anxiety that had been his companion for years had faded. He had a savings account now. He had regular customers who knew his name and valued his work. He had skills that were growing daily, as Eleanor encouraged him to experiment with new recipes and techniques. "I've been thinking," Jack said, carefully arranging pastries in the display case, "about taking some business classes at the community. And college, just 1 or 2 at first." Eleanor beamed. "An excellent idea. The cafe could use a manager with formal training." "Manager?" Jax looked up, surprised. "Well, not immediately," Eleanor clarified, her eyes twinkling. "But I'm not getting any younger. Someone will need to take over more responsibility eventually." The bell above the door jingled as new customers entered. Before returning to work, Jax glanced at Star, who was watching him with what he could have sworn was satisfaction in her amber eyes. "I think she approves of your career advancement plans," Eleanor chuckled. Jax smiled, remembering the starving cat who had shared his meager meal that rainy night that now seemed like a lifetime ago. "She always did have good judgment," he said. 1 year to the day after Jax had first shared his meal with a starving cat, he closed the cafe early. The small private event sign on the door had generated curious looks from regular customers, but Eleanor had insisted on the special occasion. "It's an anniversary worth celebrating," she'd said, her tone brooking no argument. Now, as the autumn wind rattled the windows, so similar to the night he'd first met Star, Jax put the finishing touches on the small feast he'd prepared. Nothing elaborate, just comfort food made with care. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and a selection of vegetables from the farmer's market. For dessert, a simple apple pie cooled on the counter, its cinnamon aroma filling the cafe. The table was set for 3, Eleanor, Jax, and a special place for Star, complete with a small plate of cooked chicken prepared just for her. The cat watched the proceedings from her perch, seemingly aware of the significance of the occasion. "Everything looks wonderful," Eleanor said, entering from the bookshop side where she'd been arranging a new display. "You've outdone yourself." "Least I could do," Jax replied, untying his apron and hanging it on its hook. "After all, if it weren't for you and Star, I wouldn't be here to celebrate anything." As they settled at the table, Jax placed a small piece of chicken on Star's plate. The cat descended gracefully from her perch and approached the table, her movements far more elegant than the desperate creature she'd once been. "A toast," Eleanor said, raising her glass, "to second chances." "To kindness," Jax added, touching his glass to hers. They ate and talked, sharing stories and plans for the future. Eleanor spoke of her granddaughter Lucy, who was planning a visit from Europe in the spring. Jax discussed the business course he'd started and his ideas for expanding the cafe menu. When they finished, Jax reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "I wanted to mark the occasion," he said, sliding it across the table to Eleanor. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small framed photograph. It showed Jax and Star sitting on the counter of the cafe, both looking toward the camera with matching expressions of contentment. "For your collection," Jax explained, "to go alongside the one of Lucy and Comet." Eleanor's eyes shimmered with emotion as she studied the photograph. "Perfect," she whispered. "Absolutely perfect." After dinner, as Eleanor retired to her apartment with the photograph tucked carefully under her arm, Jax stood by the cafe window watching the streetlights flicker on against the darkening sky. Star jumped onto the windowsill beside him, pressing her warm side against his hand. From his pocket, Jax withdrew a small treat, half of a tuna sandwich he'd saved from lunch. He broke it in 2 and placed half in front of Star, just as he had done that very first night. 1 year ago, he said softly. I thought I was giving up my last meal to a stray cat." He smiled as Star delicately ate her portion. "Turns out I was just sharing dinner with my future best friend," Star finished. Her treat and looked up at him, blinking slowly in that way cats do when they're completely content. Jax ran a gentle finger over the white star-shaped mark on her chest. "You know what I've learned this year?" he continued, speaking as much to himself as to Star. "Kindness is never wasted. Even when you think you have nothing left to give, sharing. What little you have can change everything." Outside, a light rain began to fall, drops glistening in the glow of the street lamps just as they had on that fateful night. But this time, Jax wasn't trudging through it. Cold and hungry and alone. He was warm, well-fed, and surrounded by friendship and purpose. Star pressed her head against his hand, purring loudly. Jax smiled and scratched behind her ears, exactly where she liked it best. "I don't know if cats understand karma," he murmured, "but I'm pretty sure you do." He picked her up gently, cradling her against his chest as he turned away from the window. "Come on, Star. Let's go home." As they climbed the stairs to their apartment above the cafe, Jax couldn't help but marvel at how a single act of kindness, sharing, his last meal with a starving cat on a cold, rainy night, had set in motion a series of events that transformed his entire life. Some might call it karma, others might call it chance, but Jax preferred to think of it as proof that in a world that can often seem cold and uncaring, compassion creates ripples that return to us in ways we could never imagine. That night, as he drifted off to sleep with Star curled contentedly at his side, Jax knew with absolute certainty that no kindness, however small, is ever truly wasted. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales of compassion and unexpected connections. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this video to spread the message that kindness always finds its way back to us, sometimes in the most unexpected forms.